McIntyre from DePaul University. He's director of the International Studies Program and somewhat an expert on today's subject, which will be on terrorism, the subject you hear much about. So without wasting any more time, Michael, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm really terrible with microphones, so I'm just going to leave it on the stand. Is it picking up? Can everyone hear me?
No.
You might need to get it closer to your mouth,
So
unfortunately.
like this. All right, I'll try this. Last week, about this time, I had a talk on terrorism that was about half written. And then on Friday, the attacks on Paris happened. And I tore up that talk and wrote this one instead. Cities are not just dead spaces on a map. Cities have distinctive characters, and we find ourselves drawn to the characters of particular cities. For me, Paris has always been the city that I love without restraint. Yes. Yes. Is that working?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Paris has always been the city that I love without restraint. So this is an attack that I take as a personal affront. Paris. So Friday night, I spent the night saying, no, not this, not my Paris. And so I have to confess to you that what I really want right now is vengeance. I want the people responsible caught and made to pay. Since this is France, I want the guillotines hauled out, executions in the public squares, and heads stuck up on spikes as a warning to the rest. Now, I'm not saying that this is a defensible course of action. I'm saying this is the kind of vengeance that I want. But policy isn't made to satisfy my or anyone else's desire for vengeance. And even if it were, almost all of the people who carried out these attacks are now dead. That doesn't mean that the intellectual authors of the attacks have been brought to justice. And as you no doubt know, the organization that has claimed responsibility for these attacks is the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, usually abbreviated to ISIS. Sometimes it's called ISIL, which is an abbreviation for the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, or sometimes it's known by its Arabic acronym, Daesh. And I've heard that this group has threatened to cut the tongues out of anyone who calls them Daesh, because apparently that's also an Arabic word that means bigot. So I'm going to call them Daesh. Now here's the problem. We want Daesh to be a simple villain. But this villain is a complicated creature whose tentacles reach into places that are very close to home. The specific villainy of Daesh might look like something brand new, inexplicable, inhuman. But look back just a little bit, well, for me it's just to the 1980s and Russia's war on Afghanistan, and you'll find that we've seen something very like this story before. It should be called common knowledge, but perhaps it isn't, that Osama bin Laden got his start as a jihadi in alliance with the United States. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, the United States was eager to give them their own Vietnam, a bloody guerrilla war that would leave their army bruised, battered, and ideally humiliated. In addition to financing mujahideen within Afghanistan, the U.S., in association with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, recruited Muslim fighters who were outside Afghanistan to travel there to make jihad on the godless communists. The most prominent of these foreign fighters, who came to be known as Arab Afghans, was Osama bin Laden. After the Soviet Union left Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden did not hang up his jihadi hat and supported his network of fighters, who eventually became known as Al-Qaeda. Neither did they demobilize entirely. They remained active, many of them on the Indian border, for example, as a group known as Lashkar-e-Taiba, a terrorist group that's devoted to, quote-unquote, liberating Muslim-majority Kashmir from Indian rule. And while Osama bin Laden himself was eventually forced to leave his home country, Saudi Arabia, he retained influence and financial support there, even as he moved his base of operations, first to Sudan and eventually to Afghanistan. It's because of this network of financial and other support in Saudi Arabia that 15 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11 were from Saudi Arabia. Also on 9/11, I don't know how many of you actually vividly remember that day. Immediately after the attacks, the United States shut down all civilian air service in U.S. airspace, right? With one exception, right? The elite Saudis, including members of the bin Laden family, were allowed to get on private jets and get out of the country. Osama bin Laden also maintained the support of Pakistan and maintained it right up until the day of his death. He was finally found and killed in a city named Abbottabad, right? Only 1/4 mile away from the entrance to Pakistan's main military academy. It's as if he were living just a few hundred yards down the road from the main entrance to West Point. So for those of you who've seen Zero Dark 30, it's not true. It didn't happen that way. Now, if we really meant to go to the source in prosecuting bin Laden in 2001, we wouldn't have limited ourselves to Afghanistan, right? Afghanistan is just a domicile, right? The real sources of support for him were in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. But that would have meant going after key US allies that had helped us create the jihadi, Osama bin Laden. And that's what I mean when I talk about tentacles that reach into places that are very close to home. Right? Even after Osama bin Laden turned on the United States, his one-time co-financier, the United States would not renounce its alliance with the two countries that had continued to give him support, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. Meanwhile, the U.S. alliance with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf monarchies is no less important in understanding the rise of Daesh. Saudi Arabia is the key U.S. ally in the Gulf, purchases huge amounts of weapons from the U.S., keeps oil flowing, and serves as a regional strongman in countries like Bahrain and Yemen. Our alliance with the Saudi monarchy and with smaller Gulf monarchies continues an old British imperial policy of propping up tyrannical governments, often despised by the people, on the principle that governments that need external support to survive are more malleable to an empire's will. This rickety structure is a feature, it's not a bug. These countries, our allies, themselves inventions of imperial realpolitik early in the 20th century, far more than creations of their people, are the primary international funders of the terrorists who struck the United States on 9/11 and who struck France this Friday the 13th. Moreover, the United States is fully aware of this. I'm going to refer extensively now, quote extensively from a December 30th, 2009 cable from Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who's Secretary of State back then, not yet running for president, or sort of taking a lead from running for president. Right? This is a document that was released in the WikiLeaks archive. It's available on the website of the British newspaper, The Guardian. In August 2009, Special Representative to the President for Afghanistan and Pakistan, Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, in coordination with the Department of Treasury, established the Interagency Illicit Finance Task Force. The IFTF is chaired by Treasury Assistant Secretary David Cohen. It focuses on disrupting illicit finance activities in Afghanistan and Pakistan and the external financial logistical support networks of terrorist groups that operate there, such as Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and Lashkar-e-Taiba. While the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia takes seriously the threat of terrorism within Saudi Arabia, it has been an ongoing challenge to persuade Saudi officials to treat terrorist financing emanating from Saudi Arabia as a strategic priority. Due in part to the intense focus by the U.S. government over the last several years, Saudi Arabia has begun to make important progress on this front and has responded to terrorist financing concerns raised by the United States through proactively investigating and detaining financial facilitators of concern. Still, donors in Saudi Arabia constitute the most significant source of funding to Sunni terrorist groups worldwide. Continued senior-level U.S. government engagement is needed to build on initial efforts and encourage the Saudi government to take more steps to stem the flow of funds from Saudi Arabia-based sources to terrorists and extremists worldwide. This next paragraph that I'm going to read is italicized in the report. I want you to pay attention to this. Saudi Arabia remains a critical financial support base for Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, LET, that's Lashkar-e-Taiba, and other terrorist groups, including Hamas, which probably raise millions of dollars annually from Saudi sources, often during Hajj and Ramadan. In contrast to its increasingly aggressive efforts to disrupt Al-Qaeda's access to funding from Saudi sources, Riyadh, that's the capital of Saudi Arabia, has taken only limited action to disrupt fundraising for the UN 1267 listed Taliban and LET groups that are also aligned with Al-Qaeda and focused on undermining stability in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Then they move on to other countries. The U.S. government has consistently engaged the government of Kuwait about the specific activities of terrorist financiers in the country. Kuwaiti charities financing terrorism abroad and Kuwait's lack of a comprehensive anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing regime. While the government of Kuwait has demonstrated a willingness to take action when attacks target Kuwait, it has been less inclined to take action against Kuwait-based financiers and facilitators plotting attacks outside of Kuwait. Al-Qaeda and other groups continue to exploit Kuwait both as a source of funds and as a key transit point. United Arab Emirates-based donors have provided financial support to a variety of terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, LET, and other terrorist groups, including Hamas. Washington agencies note, however, that they have limited information on the identity of Taliban and LET donors and facilitators in the United Arab Emirates. Hence, there is limited information to be shared with local interlocutors. Nonetheless, the point can be emphasized that the UAE's role as a growing global financial center, coupled with weak regulatory oversight, makes it vulnerable to abuse by terrorist financiers and facilitation networks. Pakistan's intermittent support to terrorist groups and militant organizations threatens to undermine regional security and endanger U.S. national security objectives in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Although Pakistani senior officials have publicly disavowed support for these groups, some officials from Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Directorate, or ISI, continue to maintain ties with a wide array of extremist organizations, in particular the Taliban, LET, and other extremist organizations. These extremist organizations continue to find refuge in Pakistan and exploit Pakistan's extensive network of charities, NGOs, and madrasas. This network of social service institutions readily provides extremist organizations with recruits, funding, and infrastructure for planning new attacks. Qatar has adopted a largely passive approach to cooperating with the U.S. against terrorist financing. Qatar's overall level of counter-terrorist cooperation with the U.S. is considered the worst in the region. Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, UN 1267 listed LET, and other terrorist groups exploit Qatar fundraising locale. Although Qatar's security services have the capability to deal with direct threats and occasionally have put that capability to use, they have been hesitant to act against known terrorists out of concern for appearing to be aligned with the U.S. and provoking reprisals. All of the countries named here, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, Pakistan, Qatar, are U.S. allies. If we're serious about going to the source in the fight against terrorism, why do these villains get a pass? So, how does this link to the horrific night of murder and brutality in Paris? The link is Syria. How did terrorists, terrorism, terrorist funding from Saudi Arabia, the Gulf monarchies, and to a lesser extent other regional powers, spread to Syria in the first place? Syria was a brutal dictatorship, one with which the United States had a complicated relationship. Syria fought wars against the U.S. ally Israel in 1967 and 1973. As a result, Syria lost control of its territory in the Golan Heights, territory that it once returned. U.S. diplomatic, financial, and military support of Israel has made it possible for Israel to hold on to this territory to Syrian displeasure. On the other hand, when the U.S. was operating a program of extraordinary rendition, that is a program that sent suspected terrorists, usually wrongly suspected terrorists, to third countries to be interrogated under torture, Syria was one of the countries to which they were sent. Syria was also, it should be noted, one of the countries that contributed troops to the First Gulf War in 1991, the one that drove Iraq out of occupied Kuwait. During the Arab Spring in 2011, there was a massive civilian uprising against the Assad dictatorship in Syria. This uprising quickly turned bloody and thence into a civil war. The liberal, urban, secular opposition to Assad, however, was not strong enough to fight this alone. And the civil war quickly became dominated by armed conflict between Assad's regime and an armed but fragmented Islamist opposition. As early as 2012, an internal defense intelligence agency cable, now been declassified and available, concluded, internally, events are taking a clear sectarian direction. The Salafists, the Muslim Brotherhood, and AQI, that's Al-Qaeda in Iraq, are the major forces driving the insurgency in Syria. The West, Gulf countries, and Turkey support the opposition, while Russia, China, and Iran support the regime. The Defense Intelligence Agency cable then went on to project the situation of 2012 into the near future, and did so largely accurately. Development of the current events into a proxy war with support from Russia, China, and Iran. The regime is controlling areas of influence along coastal territories and is fiercely defending Homs, which is considered the primary transportation route in Syria. On the other hand, opposition forces are trying to control the eastern areas, adjacent to the western Iraqi provinces of Mosul and Anbar, in addition to neighboring Turkish borders. Western countries, the Gulf states, and Turkey are supporting these efforts, at least the efforts of the Islamists. This hypothesis is most likely in accord with the data from recent events, which will help prepare safe havens under international sheltering, similar to what transpired in Libya when Benghazi was chosen as the command center of the temporary government. And then the same cable turns its attention to effects on Iraq. The opposition forces will try to use the Iraqi territory as a safe haven for its forces taking advantage of the sympathy of the Iraqi border population. Meanwhile, trying to recruit fighters and train them on the Iraqi side in addition to harboring refugees. If the situation unravels, there is the possibility of establishing a declared or undeclared Salafist principality in eastern Syria. And this is exactly what the supporting powers to the opposition want, in order to isolate the Syrian regime, which is considered the strategic depth of the Shia expansion. deterioration of the situation has dire consequences on the Iraqi situation and are as follows. This creates the ideal atmosphere for al-Qaeda in Iraq to return to its old pockets in Mosul and Ramadi, and will provide a renewed momentum under the presumption of unifying the jihad among Sunni Iraq and Syria, and the rest of the Sunnis in the Arab world, against what it considers one enemy, the dissenters, ISI, that is, Islamic State in Iraq, could also declare an Islamic State through its union with other terrorist organizations in Iraq and Syria, which will create grave danger in regards to unifying Iraq and the protection of its territory. One thing that is clear is that a great deal of financial support for this jihadi opposition to Assad came from Saudi Arabia, the smaller Gulf monarchies, and Turkey. A little over a year ago, on October 2nd, 2014, Vice President Joe Biden engaged in an unscripted moment of candor during a question and answer session at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. This is what he said. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and tens of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were al-Nusra and al-Qaeda, and the extremist elements of jihadis were coming from other parts of the world. Now, you think I'm exaggerating? Take a look. Where did all of this go? So now that's happening, all of a sudden, everybody is awakened because this outfit called ISIL, which was al-Qaeda in Iraq, when they were essentially thrown out of Iraq, found open space in territory in Syria, worked with al-Nusra, who we declared a terrorist group early on, and we could not convince our colleagues to stop supplying them. Biden's unguarded answer caused what is technically known in Washington, D.C. as a shitstorm. His office issued a carefully circumscribed retraction. This is it. The Vice President apologized for any implication that Turkey or other allies and partners in the region had intentionally supplied or facilitated the growth of ISIL or other violent extremists in Syria. Note the key modifier, intentionally. The Vice President did not regret implying that these states had supported Daesh and other violent extremists, but he did regret implying that they did so intentionally. Moreover, the Vice President did not say that these states had not done so intentionally, but he did regret having implied in public that they did. The term for this is a faux apology. Now, this is not to say that Daesh was entirely a creation of Turkey and the Gulf states, or that Daesh was even the favored recipient of their largesse. There were many jihadi groups in Syria receiving various levels of support. Daesh probably had a larger degree of self-funding than the others, because it had created a violent organization in Iraq dating back to 2005, with funding secured to a large degree through sales of smuggled oil supplies. Moreover, Daesh has had an advantage over other jihadi groups in Syria because its military commanders have come from the disbanded Iraqi army of the Saddam Hussein era. The United States invaded, just said, okay, the army's disbanded, go home. They did. They didn't use their military expertise, and they took their weapons with them, and now they're the leaders of Daesh. In a complicated and murky arena where these jihadist groups were sometimes allies, sometimes enemies, and sometimes both at once, Daesh's superior military performance and more secure financing led to a series of defections from less successful jihadist groups to Daesh, so that money, men, and materiel originally destined for other groups in Syria often ended up in Daesh's hands. The wake-up call for everyone came on June 10, 2014, when Daesh seized Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq. At that point, speculation was rife that Daesh was on the verge of succeeding in creating an extremist Sunni state across most of Syria and the Sunni majority areas of Iraq. The United States called for arming quote-unquote moderate fighters in Syria against both Daesh and Assad. The problem was there weren't any. Free Syrian army had become a force too weak, not a sustained opposition, and the one sustained force that was anti-Assad, that was left as a competitor to Daesh, Jabhat al-Nusra, was itself affiliated with al-Qaeda. Kurdish militia, the Kurdish Peshmerga, were willing to fight. They often did so heroically, but they were far outgunned. As far as the big regional powers, right, Saudi Arabia and Turkey, Saudi Arabia is more concerned about the spreading influence of Iran, and Turkey is more concerned about the internal threat represented by the Kurds than either are about Daesh. The only two powerful states that have a coherent strategy against Daesh are Iran and Russia. Right? They quite straightforwardly support the Assad regime. The U.S., meanwhile, bombs and tries to find someone to do the ground fighting against Daesh. And in this, it has been joined since September 2014 by France. I know you were wondering who France. Now, France's support, right, while it isn't of absolutely crucial importance, is not inconsequential. France has the largest military establishment in Western Europe. It has independent nuclear forces. It has a large and sophisticated military industry, and it maintains its own imperial sphere of interest in its former African colonies, in North Africa, and in the Near East, especially in its former possessions, Lebanon and Syria. France intervened militarily to support the Libyan uprising against Gaddafi even before the United States, and it signed on to the bombing campaign against Daesh without hesitation. Shortly before the November 13th attacks, France had repositioned its aircraft carrier, the Charles de Gaulle, in the Gulf to add to its military weight. Now, this counteroffensive against Daesh did have some effects. It limited their advances, it gave cover to what ground opposition could be found, it forced Daesh to adopt guerrilla warfare tactics instead of conventional warfare tactics. It also helped convince Daesh to engage in heightened acts of terror outside Iraq and Syria. And needless to say, but perhaps worth emphasizing, is the fact that Daesh was already engaged in far greater acts of terror within Iraq and Syria. Indeed, the fighting on all sides in Syria has led to one of the largest displacements of civilian population in this or the last century. Daesh's external campaign of terror reached a crescendo with 4 separate acts in a 2-week period. A Daesh affiliate in Egypt has claimed responsibility for the October 31st bombing of a Russian civilian aircraft that killed all 224 passengers. Daesh-affiliated fighters in Afghanistan beheaded 7 ethnic Hazara hostages, 2 of them children, on November 9th. Hazara because the Hazara are Shia and they are Farsi speakers. They speak the language of Daesh's enemy in Iran. On November 11th, a Daesh bombing in Beirut killed 43 and wounded more than 200. And of course, on November 13th, Daesh launched multiple attacks in Paris, in which, by the most recent count of able to find, 129 were killed, 352 injured, 99 of them critically. Now let's imagine that in response to these atrocities, we decide to launch an all-out offensive against Daesh, right? Determined to wipe it from the map and ensure that it can never do this again. Could we do this? Yes, we could. But the first question to ask there is, who is this we you speak of? Right? Who could do this? Now there are a number of candidates, powers both regional and global, who have an interest in completely and utterly destroying Daesh. This would include Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, Hezbollah, the Shia militias in Iraq, Kurdish forces in both Syria and Iraq, the Assad regime in Syria, France, and perhaps the United States and Britain. Notice that none of the U.S. allies that I listed earlier as funders of terrorism, funders of Daesh, are on this list. A coalition of that scale could easily prevail militarily over Daesh. But there would be consequences. It would leave at its weight a Syria once again thoroughly controlled by the Assad military dictatorship. It would leave an Iraq ruled by a Shia majority, whose Sunni minority would have no rights. Presumably the Kurds in Iraq would maintain the current level of autonomy. It would decisively shift the balance of power in the Middle East away from Sunnis and towards Shia. And for those very reasons, I'm telling you right now that this winnable war against Daesh will not be undertaken. Don't wait for it, don't hope for it, it's not going to happen. Right? If it did, it would provoke howls of outrage from the main U.S. allies in the region, that's Israel, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. It would decisively shift the balance of power in the Gulf towards Iran. It would restore Assad's repressive dictatorship in Syria, and it would strengthen Russia's role as a world power. The U.S. is not going to go for that. Now you can make the case, right, that these are good reasons for avoiding such a showdown with Daesh. But whether they're good reasons or bad, they mean that the U.S. is not committed to defeating Daesh at any cost. I'm not even sure that France, bloodied as it is committed to defeating Daesh at any cost, and it would be very unlikely to make the alliances I just suggested over U.S. opposition, which would certainly be there. We are instead likely to get more of the same at an increased level of intensity. France has already stepped up its airstrikes in Syria and Iraq. The United States may well follow suit. The G20, when it met in Turkey this week, issued a predictably toothless pledge to fight Daesh more strongly. The motley collection of anti-Daesh ground forces will continue as an incoherent opposition force on the ground. Iran and Russia will continue to support Assad, perhaps to some greater effect. And Western countries, including France, probably the United States, will undertake repressive anti-terrorist measures. Greater border controls, heightened surveillance of Muslims, increased policing designed to prevent the last attack, as if terrorists will be kind enough to do the same thing in the same way again so that we can catch them this time. All of which are going to be utterly ineffective, as ineffective as those ridiculous TSA people at the airports are. It's a kind of theater designed to heighten apprehension and present the illusion that something is being done. Now the odds that this particular pastiche of tactics will defeat Daesh, let alone prevent the emergence of the next Daesh, are small to minuscule. On the contrary, such measures are recruiting posters for the next round of angry, frustrated, disillusioned, idealistic, and stupid young men who are exploited by Daesh, tools to be wrapped in a suicide bomber's belt and unleashed. Each time people are vilified for their faith, each time a woman is spat upon and harassed for wearing the veil, each time people are stopped and searched on the street for looking Muslim, every time that happens, the social media engine room of Daesh snaps it up and points at it as another example. You see how the Crusaders hate us and taunt us and defile our faith and our families. No amount of ruthlessness will ever end that. Instead, it gives Daesh exactly what it wants. Another generation of cannon fodder to be indoctrinated, exploited, turned into killers. And there will always be more impressionable young people looking for a cause for their helpless fury. The geopolitical roots of this disaster are nearly a century old, fixed in the imperial carve-up of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War, a settlement that the historian David Fromkin has characterized as a peace to end all peace. The of unprincipled alliances that dominant global powers have made there, the willingness of all parties to support terrorist groups when it suits their purposes, and the unending series of conflicts that this configuration of forces sets in motion again and again will not change until revolutionary change comes to the region. Now, a few short years ago, many of us entertained the hope that we were witnessing just such a revolution. And now, the Arab Spring seems like ancient history. Bahrain's democratic uprising was put down by the combined forces of Bahrain and the Saudi monarchy. Yemen and Syria descended into civil war and now suffer from both civil war and a war made upon them from the outside. Saudi Arabia is bombing Yemen on a daily basis now. Egypt's brief democratic moment has been crushed and the military regime restored. The Libyan uprising that removed Gaddafi has resulted in a level of chaos and violence worse than the regime it replaced. Only Tunisia, the birthplace of the Arab Spring, has reaped the fruits of the uprising. But if the outlook appears grim, let us remember that mere days before the Arab Spring, the outlook appeared no less grim. Yet there, below the surface, in one tyranny after another, resistance was forming. I'm not claiming that a new Arab Spring is in the offing, or even if it is, that it will succeed this time. Revolution is unimaginably hard and cannot be won with illusions. But I will say that only resolute popular defiance can break the power of tyranny. And France should know this better than any Western country. Its national anthem, the Marseillaise, encrusted as it is with time and repetition, was written at a moment when the French Revolution was threatened by invading foreign armies. The song, written by Roger de Lille, originally known as Le Chant de Guerre de l'Armée du Rhin, the Army of the Rhine's war song, hurled revolutionary ardor and defiance at the armies that were poised to invade the French Republic. I will give you some of the words in both French and English. Tremblez, tyrans et vous perfides. Tremble, tyrants and betrayers. L'opprobre de tous les partis. The shame of all parties. Tremblez, vos projets parricides. Tremble, your parricidal schemes vont enfin recevoir le prix. Will finally receive their reward. Tout est soldat pour vous combattre. Everyone is a soldier to combat you. S'ils tombent, nos jeunes héros, if they fall, our young heroes, la terre en produit de nouveau. The earth will produce new ones. Contre vous, tout prêt à se battre, ready to fight against you. Aux armes, citoyens. To arms, citizens. Formez vos bataillons. Form your battalions. Marchons, marchons. Let's march. Let's march. Qu'un sang impur, let an impure blood abreuve nos sillons, water our furrows. But this song is over 220 years old. Doesn't it still mean anything? Let's move forward in time. Not to your lifetime, not even to my lifetime, to my parents' lifetime. To 1942, when the great anti-Nazi film Casablanca was made. In this fictional setting, Casablanca, a city in French Morocco, administered by a collaborationist French government thoroughly under the thumb of the Nazis, is filled with refugees hoping to flee, but they need exit visas to do so, and those visas are almost impossible to obtain. But there's more to the story of this movie than is apparent on screen. Almost all of the actors in the movie were also refugees from Nazi-conquered Europe. appearing in this film was, for them, an act of political affirmation that Nazism would not be Europe's future. In one of the many famous scenes from the film, Nazi soldiers begin to sing the aggressively anti-French anthem, Die Wacht am Rhein. Refugees in Rick's Café Américain, the bar where most of the movie is shot, and it's not in Casablanca, it's on a lot in Hollywood somewhere.
They actually made Casablanca, like some American went there, and Casablanca and made like a recreational spot.
Not much. I mean, it was Nazi-occupied territory. It couldn't be done like that. Right? But, so in Rick's Café Américain, as you watch the scene, right, of people who are playing refugees in the bar, but who in fact are themselves refugees in Hollywood, right, you'll notice that some of the actors are crying as they sing the song. Right? Those tears are not feigned. Right? They're not acting. Right? In singing the Marseillaise on screen, they, and almost all of them were not French, right, were also launching their ardor, their defiance, and their determination against the very real Nazis who still occupy their countries. So now I'm going to see if I can make the tech work and show you this scene. So, how can we put an end to terrorism? You can never put an end to terrorism by relying on great power, realpolitik. Great powers will always place that fight at a lower level of priority than maintaining their geopolitical power. Moreover, let's be blunt, they will also deploy their own terrorists or engage in terror themselves when it suits their interests. Terrorism exists in symbiosis with tyranny and imperial realpolitik. If you want to get rid of terrorism, then you must dry up those twin sources of terrorism. The revolutionary defiance of the Marseillaise is one place to start. So sing it. Sing it in solidarity with France's victims of terror these days. But sing it remembering what it means. Tremble, tyrants. And there, I'll open it up.
question. Before I ask the question, I want to preface it.
Would you mind if I give you a spectrum?
People in the back.
Before I ask my question, I want to preface it by saying I was in Israel here 3 or 4 years ago. And the tour stopped at the border between Israel and the Palestinian section. Up on the hill was a magnificent townhouse project that was equal to any of the fine ones we have around here. Down in the valley in our vehicle was a tent structure. Old tent, torn tents, and then there were some new tents. There were some white tents. And our leader said, look at the progress the Palestinians have made under Israeli control, from tin shacks to white tents. Up on the top here were these beautiful townhouses. My question is this, specifically with regard to ISIS, is religion a mask to cover concern over economic inequality and political power?
I think it's the second of those. Right? I think it's political power. Neither Syria nor Iraq historically have been regions of great religious conflict. They both have Shia and Sunni populations. They both have Christian minorities. They both have other religious minorities and ethnic minorities within the countries. There's never been, until recently, a civil war that pitted those forces against each other. Which doesn't mean that particular groups didn't have power. Right? So clearly, in Iraq under Saddam Hussein, the Sunni had more power than the Shia. Right? The Assad family in Syria is an Alawite family. Right? Alawite branch of Shia Islam, regarded by Sunnis as even worse than the Shia. Political power is on the table, but in both cases, it was political fracture of the existing regime that brought those tensions to the surface. So religion had always been there. As far as economic concerns, I don't know enough to say. I don't know who's wealthier in Iraq and Syria. What I do know is that the Sunni have long been shut out of power in Syria and have recently been shut out of power in Iraq. And the project of Daesh is the reestablishment of the caliphate, right? The vast Sunni state that was one of the most powerful states in the world up until the sacking of Baghdad in the 1290s. Right? So it's definitely a Sunni project, but it's a project to establish Sunni power. Right? Now, I should also remark that there are a wide range of Sunni views on the relationship between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam. Right? Most of them, the version that you'll find taught at the oldest Muslim school in the world, in Al-Azhar in Egypt, right, accepts Shiism as one valid interpretation of Islam, although not really shared by the teachers. On the other hand, Wahhabism, Salafism, right, the doctrine promoted by Saudi Arabia, regards the Shia as apostates. Right? So insofar as there's a religious ideology at work there, it's the religious ideology that is promoted and has been promoted for decades by Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for your talk, because I was almost losing my hopes that nobody in the scholarly community is going to say what you said a few minutes ago. You know, the picture isn't pretty. I am originally from Russia, and I read a lot of Russian sources as much as I read American, Israeli, Palestinian sources on the subject. And what the hope for me when I listen to the candidates, Republican and Democratic candidates, most of the time I lose my hope entirely when I listen to them. But there is a glimpse of hope that maybe, just maybe, with the exit of Assad that would be planned by, cooperating powers, United States, Russia, France, Iran, and few others that still want to fight Daesh. Maybe with that exit of Assad as a condition of this cooperation, something can be done. Is my hope entirely naive, or you think that there is still hope and we can still find a solution?
I'm trying to think how you present that deal to Assad in a way that he would accept it. Right? Because it's easy to think of Assad as an individual. That is, here you go, step down from power, your money is already in the bank in Switzerland, go there, retire, live a good life, leave this country to other people to sort out. The problem is that it's not just any individual, Bashar Assad. It is a very large clan that he's the head of, all of whom are Alawite, all of whom will be slaughtered if Daesh wins. So you're asking him to make a choice saying, yeah, I'll escape to Switzerland, maybe I can take some of my family to Switzerland, and I'm going to leave the rest behind to be slaughtered. It might work, it could be convinced, but who's going to convince him to take that deal? Well, okay, so we'll slaughter your family. Unless you take the deal. No, I mean, seriously, so the Russians make him an offer. What offer do they make him?
Well, remember Shamil war in Russia in 19th century. Shamil was Chechen fighter, and of course it's much smaller scale. But actually, Russia was fighting Shamil for years and years, and finally they offered him a deal to escape to St. Petersburg and live in St. Petersburg with his family. And that was the only way that they actually defeated that movement. But I'm not saying that it's the same. It's much more complicated.
But since they were the belligerent, right, they could also make a promise, your family, that is some part of your family, can come live in St. Petersburg, and we won't kill the others, right? But Russia's in no place to make that promise on behalf of Daesh if Daesh wins. So, I mean, it's very, very tough. But I actually appreciate you saying, and I'm sure you know, and then telling the story that, of course, you and I know that I had no idea about. That's a great story.
You got a question over here?
Do you, when you mentioned earlier about how they whip up ISIS in particular and other groups, whip up support among young, impressionable idiots, do you think, I see kind of a parallel to the rise of fascism in Europe during the 20s and 30s, where they kind of whipped up support to young idiots. And I think, do you think that ISIS, Daesh, whatever the hell you want to call them, or those groups want to call themselves, do you think they also double as a fascist organization as well as a terrorist group?
Fascist is a difficult term to use because it's not an analytical term, it's a polite curse word, right? You call someone a fascist and it's like you're sort of thrown down and it's like, now we're ready to fight. Fascism was a very particular kind of movement in Europe at a particular moment in history. Okay, so not every extremely nasty authoritarian movement is fascist. It is true that fascist movements in Europe tended to have largely young militias at their disposal who would go around and beat up, kill people that the various fascist parties would killed or beaten up, right? It's happened in Germany, it happened in Italy, it happened in Spain, it happened elsewhere. But if we're going to sort of look for fascism today,
Well, I know they're not particularly actually a fascist group, but I just can't help but see the crossover.
but the point is that there are actual fascist groups, right?
Yeah.
There are, Jobbik in Hungary, right, emerged as a major party, right? Golden Dawn in Greece, and both of these are outright Nazi parties, right? There are bigger parties, right? Parties that threaten to take power in major European countries that also trace their roots back to fascism. The most important one being the National Front in France. Right? And they want to take advantage of this because now they can say, see those 5 million Muslims? We told you they were a problem, right? Let's deport them. Let's put them in camps, right? I mean, they'll be playing this, and the people playing that will be people who are really outright fascists. I mean, so fascist that they've gotten a kind of makeover in recent years, right? So Marine Le Pen has sort of replaced her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, as the head of the party, and has sort of tried to take the rough edges off. But she regularly has to disavow stuff that he says, right? So this old guy would still run around saying oh, Hitler didn't kill 6 million Jews, right? When it comes to Daesh, I wouldn't call it fascist in terms of sort of looking for a genealogy,
Well, I know that
right? Sort of
much.
looking for descent, a line of descent. What it is a group that has a very clear territorial ambition. Right? That is, it's not there just to do terror, it's there to create a state. Right? It has an ideology, right, that Islam only has one legitimate form, Sunni Islam, which admittedly includes 4 different schools of thought, right? But only those 4 schools of thought are legitimate. That other Muslims are apostates and need to either revert to true Islam or be exterminated. And that a caliphate imposing religious law should be established over the heartland of Sunni Islam.
Oh, so they're just aspiring theocrats, really.
Yeah, I mean, if I were going to pick one word, I think authoritarian, murderous theocrats would be better than fascists.
Yeah, all right. Fine.
I'll get you a.
So I had to start off a minute, so I'm not sure if you covered this or not, but I'm not sure how recent it was, but I think a while back, the Islamic State said something along the lines of how they want to turn Western society potentially against Muslims. That way, when they are, if there is a Muslim or a group of Muslims in a mostly Western Christian type of country, that they will feel like they do have nowhere to turn, but towards the quote-unquote Islamic State. And I was wondering, just because the fascist discussion kind of made me think about how if, when they're doing that, if that's also part of why they are being very, do you think that's also kind of why they're being very, very public when in fact these happen about, oh yes, this was us? It's outlining it just so also knowing how Western media is going to react and how groups of bigots are going to react and all of that.
I think that is certainly part of Josh's strategic calculation. That is, the more anti-Muslim bigotry they can generate in Europe, the better for them. On the other hand, in terms of their own propaganda, they don't say publicly, we want to turn Europe against Muslims. What they say is, Europe has always been against Muslims. Europe has been against Muslims since the days of the Crusades, since the Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula, running through the destruction of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, and right up to the present day, right? So what they will say is not, well, we've turned Europe against you, so now you have to join us. What they will say is, you see, we've ripped the mask off of Europe's liberalism, and now they're revealing the true face.
Okay, I think we have to end things now, because many people have